Between 1883 and 1892, Schmidt's Meat Market in Manhattan's Lower East Side was New York City's most popular butcher shop. For 9 years, it sold what customers believed was the finest pork in the city to thousands of satisfied customers. But in the summer of 1892, when police raided the shop, they discovered a horrific truth. Heinrich Schmidt had never had a pork supplier. The remains of 63 different people found in his cold storage revealed what that meat actually was. And for 9 years, customers had unknowingly become cannibals. Before we descend into the horror that operated behind the respectable facade of a Manhattan butcher shop, this channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the darkest truths hidden in America's past. If you're one of the few who can handle these dark revelations, subscribe now and leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover the stories that others dare not tell. Now, let's journey back to 1883, when New York's immigrant neighborhoods provided perfect hunting grounds for a predator who understood that some people could disappear without anyone noticing or caring. The Lower East Side of Manhattan in 1883 was one of the most densely populated areas in the world, a teeming warren of tenement buildings packed with immigrant families seeking to build new lives in America. The neighborhood was home to hundreds of thousands of people, predominantly German, Irish, Italian, and Eastern European Jewish immigrants who worked wherever they could find employment. The streets were constantly crowded and chaotic, creating an environment where individual people could easily become lost in the masses, and where disappearances might not be noticed or investigated. Into this landscape came Heinrich Schmidt, a 41-year-old German immigrant who arrived in New York in early 1883, claiming to have worked as a master butcher in Hamburg. Schmidt was a large, powerfully built man, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing approximately 240 pounds. He spoke fluent German, adequate English, and some Yiddish, allowing him to communicate effectively with the neighborhood's diverse population. He presented himself as a skilled craftsman, seeking to establish a proper German-style butcher shop that would provide quality meat at fair prices. Schmidt purchased a small storefront on Rivington Street in March of 1883, using money he claimed to have saved during his years working in Hamburg. The location was strategic, situated in the heart of the Lower East Side's busiest commercial district. The shop had a large front area for customer service, a work area behind the counter, and most importantly, a substantial basement with a walk-in cold storage room that Schmidt immediately equipped with modern refrigeration equipment. Schmidt's Meat Market opened in April of 1883 with an impressive display of various pork products, chops, roasts, sausages, bacon, and specialty German preparations. The quality of the meat was exceptional, and Schmidt's prices were remarkably competitive with other butchers in the area. Word spread quickly through the German community that a master butcher from the old country had opened a shop offering authentic German quality meat at reasonable prices. What made Schmidt particularly successful was his attention to customer service and his understanding of immigrant psychology. He spoke to German customers in their native language, discussing news from Germany, and shared memories of the homeland. He extended credit to struggling families and gave children small treats. Within months, Schmidt's Meat Market had become an established fixture, with Schmidt himself viewed as a respected member of the German immigrant business community. But the exceptional quality and competitive prices had a horrific explanation. Schmidt was not purchasing pork from suppliers as other butchers did. Instead, he was obtaining his meat through a systematic program of murdering vulnerable immigrants, processing their bodies in his basement, and selling the resulting flesh as premium pork to unsuspecting customers. The selection process Schmidt employed was coldly calculated. He targeted individuals who were new to America, who had no established families or support networks in New York, who spoke little or no English, and whose disappearances would not be noticed or reported. Recent arrivals to the immigrant neighborhoods were perfect victims, as they had not yet established the connections that might make them missed. Schmidt identified potential victims through careful observation and conversation. As a butcher operating in the heart of the immigrant district, he had natural opportunities to meet people and learn about their circumstances. He would engage newcomers in conversation, asking where they had come from, whether they had family in New York, what kind of work they were seeking. He positioned himself as a helpful fellow immigrant, offering advice about finding employment and housing. Those who revealed themselves as isolated and vulnerable were marked in Schmidt's mind as potential sources of meat. The actual abductions typically occurred after Schmidt had established some level of trust with his intended victims. He would offer to help them find work, claiming to know factory owners or construction foremen who were hiring. He would arrange to meet them at his shop after closing hours. Once the victims were in his control in the basement late at night, Schmidt would kill them quickly through blows to the head with the same tools he used for his legitimate butchering work. The basement of Schmidt's meat market had been converted into a human processing facility. The cold storage room, which customers assumed contained hanging sides of pork, actually served a much darker purpose. Schmidt had equipped the basement with professional butchering equipment, including heavy tables for processing carcasses, specialized knives and saws, hooks for hanging bodies, and rendering equipment. Everything was organized with the efficiency of someone who had indeed worked as a professional butcher. The processing methodology Schmidt employed revealed both his professional skill and his complete moral depravity. Human bodies were divided in the same manner as pork carcasses, with different sections being prepared for different products. What would correspond to pork chops came from human ribs and loin. Roasts came from larger muscle groups. Ground meat for sausages came from less desirable cuts. Fat was rendered into lard. Even bones were saved and used for stock or sold to manufacturers who assumed they were receiving animal bones. Schmidt's professional skill allowed him to disguise human meat as pork with remarkable effectiveness. The cuts he prepared looked identical to pork cuts of comparable quality. His sausages, which became particularly famous in the neighborhood for their excellent flavor, were prepared with spices that masked any differences in taste. Customers genuinely believed they were buying pork, and many considered it the finest available in the Lower East Side. During the first year of operation, Schmidt murdered and processed at least 9 immigrants whose disappearances were never investigated. The victims included 7 men and 2 women, all recent arrivals, all between 19 and 35, all fitting Schmidt's criteria of being isolated and vulnerable. Their bodies were systematically processed and sold to customers who had no idea they were consuming human flesh. The shop prospered enormously during this first year. Schmidt's combination of excellent quality, competitive prices, and superior customer service attracted a loyal customer base that continued to grow. The shop's reputation spread beyond just the German community. Schmidt became relatively wealthy by immigrant neighborhood standards, though he was careful not to display excessive prosperity. By spring of 1884, Schmidt had refined his operation to run with industrial efficiency. He had established a routine for identifying victims, for abducting them without witnesses, for processing their bodies quickly, and for distributing the meat. The entire process typically took 2 to 3 weeks. At that rate, Schmidt needed to kill approximately 1 person every 2 to 3 weeks to maintain inventory and meet customer demand. The frequency of disappearances in the Lower East Side was high enough that Schmidt's victims represented merely a small anomaly. Immigrants moved to other cities, people died from disease, and were buried with no one to claim them. The social infrastructure for tracking missing persons was minimal, especially for immigrants. Schmidt operated in an environment where his victims could vanish without creating any pattern that might attract official attention. As years progressed, Schmidt became increasingly confident. The frequency of his killings gradually increased to one every 2 weeks, and sometimes more frequently during busy seasons. By his 5th year, Schmidt was killing approximately 30 people per year, with their bodies being consumed by thousands of New York families who believed they were purchasing legitimate pork. Schmidt's customer base continued to expand, with the shop's reputation attracting customers from beyond the immediate neighborhood. Some of Manhattan's wealthier residents began sending servants to purchase what they believed was exceptionally high-quality German pork. Several restaurants began purchasing meat from Schmidt. His sausages became so popular that he was able to increase prices while maintaining strong sales. Schmidt kept detailed business ledgers that appeared legitimate on the surface. He recorded sales, expenses, and inventory professionally, but he never recorded purchases of meat from suppliers because he had none. This absence of documentation would eventually prove significant. By 1890, 7 years into his operation, Schmidt had murdered at least 54 people. The shop had become one of the most successful butcher operations in the Lower East Side, with Schmidt employing 2 young German immigrant assistants to help with customer service. These assistants apparently had no knowledge of Schmidt's basement activities and genuinely believed they were working for a legitimate butcher shop. The pattern of disappearances had finally begun to attract some attention. Several charitable organizations working with immigrant populations had begun comparing notes about people they had helped who subsequently vanished. A German-language newspaper published an article expressing concern, and most significantly, a New York Police Department detective named Thomas Murphy had begun to notice that an unusual number of missing persons reports seemed to cluster around the same general area of the Lower East Side. Detective Murphy's interest was both professional and personal. His younger sister had married a German immigrant, and Murphy had developed sympathy for newcomers to America. When he began investigating scattered missing persons reports, he noticed that virtually all described recent immigrants who had been in New York only weeks or months before vanishing. He also noticed they had all been living or working in the same general area. Murphy began conducting informal interviews in the neighborhood, talking to people at immigrant aid societies, churches, and various businesses. During one interview in early 1892, Murphy learned something crucial. A woman at a German immigrant aid society mentioned that several young men she had helped had told her they were going to meet someone about possible employment, and she had never heard from them again. When Murphy pressed for details, the woman remembered that at least 3 had mentioned going to see Heinrich Schmidt, the butcher on Rivington Street, who had offered to help them find work. This information triggered Murphy's investigative instincts. He began observing Schmidt and his shop more carefully. What particularly caught his attention was the absence of delivery wagons. Every other butcher regularly received deliveries, but Schmidt's shop never seemed to receive such deliveries despite doing substantial business. When Murphy asked other butchers about Schmidt's suppliers, he received vague answers suggesting no one knew where Schmidt obtained his meat. By spring of 1892, Detective Murphy had accumulated enough circumstantial evidence to convince his superiors to authorize a formal investigation. What Murphy would discover in Schmidt's basement would shock New York City and reveal one of the most horrific criminal operations in American history. Detective Thomas Murphy's investigation into Heinrich Schmidt intensified throughout the spring of 1892 as he methodically gathered evidence that would justify a search warrant for the butcher shop. Murphy understood that he was dealing with circumstantial suspicions rather than concrete proof, and that raiding a respected businessman's establishment without sufficient cause could end his career and expose the police department to criticism. But his instincts told him that something profoundly wrong was happening at Schmidt's meat market, and he was determined to uncover the truth. Murphy's approach was methodical, and patient, he began by documenting every missing person report he could find that involved the Lower East Side area over the previous 9 years. The task was complicated by the fact that many disappearances were never officially reported, especially among immigrant populations who were wary of police or who assumed that missing family members had simply moved to other cities. Murphy worked with immigrant aid societies, churches, and community organizations to compile a list of people who had vanished without explanation. The list Murphy eventually compiled was staggering. Over 60 people had disappeared from the Lower East Side neighborhood during the 9 years that Schmidt's shop had been in operation. While not all of these disappearances could be linked directly to Schmidt, the statistical concentration was remarkable. Murphy calculated that the area immediately surrounding Schmidt's shop had a disappearance rate nearly 3 times higher than comparable neighborhoods in other parts of Manhattan. More significantly, Murphy discovered a pattern in the timing of disappearances. When he plotted the dates on which people had last been seen, he noticed that the disappearances occurred at remarkably regular intervals, approximately one every 2 to 3 weeks. This pattern suggested systematic activity rather than random chance, and it aligned perfectly with what would be necessary to maintain a steady meat supply for a busy butcher shop. Murphy also conducted surveillance of Schmidt's shop, carefully documenting its operations and looking for any irregularities. He observed customers coming and going, noting the volume of business and the types of products being sold. He watched for delivery wagons bringing meat supplies and confirmed that no such deliveries ever occurred. He even made several purchases himself, buying various pork products and noting their exceptional quality and the reasonable prices Schmidt charged. During one of these purchases, Murphy engaged Schmidt in conversation, testing the butcher's responses to questions about his suppliers and business operations. Schmidt was friendly and professional, explaining that he purchased his pork from various rural farmers and small suppliers who delivered directly to his cold storage in the early morning hours before the shop opened. The explanation was plausible enough on the surface, but Murphy's investigation of rural suppliers in the regions Schmidt claimed to work with revealed no record of anyone doing business with a Manhattan butcher named Schmidt. The breakthrough in Murphy's investigation came in June of 1892, when he interviewed a German immigrant woman named Anna Weber, who had recently arrived in New York. Weber had been helped by the same immigrant aid society that had previously provided Murphy with information, and she mentioned something that caught the detective's attention. Her brother Carl had arrived in New York 3 months earlier, in March, and had written to her about finding temporary work and meeting helpful people in the German community. The last letter she received from Carl mentioned that a butcher named Schmidt had offered to help him find permanent factory employment, and that he was going to meet Schmidt at his shop after closing time to discuss the opportunity. Carl had never been heard from again. Murphy showed Anna Weber a photograph he had obtained of Heinrich Schmidt. She confirmed that this was the man Carl had mentioned in his letter. This was the first direct evidence linking a specific missing person to Schmidt in a way that suggested potential foul play, rather than simply coincidental geographic proximity. Armed with this information and the statistical evidence he had compiled, Murphy requested authorization from his superiors to obtain a search warrant for Schmidt's meat market. The request for a search warrant was initially met with skepticism. Schmidt was a respected businessman with no criminal record, and the evidence Murphy had compiled was largely circumstantial. The police department was reluctant to authorize a raid that might prove embarrassing if nothing was found, but Murphy's reputation as a thorough investigator and his detailed documentation of the disappearance pattern eventually convinced his captain to support the request. On July 8, 1892, a judge issued a warrant authorizing police to search Schmidt's meat market, including the basement and cold storage areas. The raid was scheduled for the early morning of July 12, 1892, before the shop would normally open for business. Murphy assembled a team of 8 officers, including 2 who spoke German fluently, and briefed them on what they might encounter. He emphasized the need to secure the basement immediately and to prevent Schmidt from destroying any evidence. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the police team arrived at Schmidt's shop. Schmidt was already awake and preparing for the day's business when police knocked on the door. He answered with apparent calm, showing no obvious signs of guilt or panic when Murphy presented the search warrant. Schmidt asked what the police were looking for, and Murphy responded that they needed to inspect his business records and storage facilities as part of an investigation into missing persons in the neighborhood. Schmidt maintained his composure, stating that he had nothing to hide and offering to cooperate fully with the search. The search of the main floor of the shop revealed nothing obviously suspicious. The display cases contained various cuts of pork that appeared completely normal. The work area behind the counter was clean and professionally organized. Schmidt's business ledgers showed detailed records of sales and expenses, though as Murphy had noted, there were no records of purchases from meat suppliers. When Murphy pointed this out, Schmidt repeated his explanation about buying from small farmers who dealt in cash and kept minimal records. But when police descended into the basement, they discovered what Murphy had suspected, but what still shocked even the experienced officers who had prepared themselves for disturbing findings. The basement had been divided into several distinct areas, each serving a specific function in what was clearly a systematic operation for processing human bodies. The first area contained what appeared to be a holding space with heavy chains mounted to the walls and stains on the floor that would later be confirmed as human blood. The second area was dominated by a massive butchering table with drainage channels and leather restraints. The walls were lined with specialized cutting tools, saws, and cleavers. The third area contained the meat processing equipment, including grinders and rendering vessels, but it was the cold storage room that provided the most damning evidence. The room contained numerous packages of meat wrapped and labeled in the same manner as the products sold in the shop upstairs. When officers opened these packages, experienced butchers among the police team immediately recognized that the meat was not pork. The bone structure was wrong. The muscle tissue was different, and when they looked more carefully, they found cuts that could only have come from human bodies. Even more horrifying were the remains that had not yet been fully processed. In the far corner of the cold storage room, police discovered partial bodies in various stages of butchering. The remains showed clear evidence of systematic dismemberment using professional butchering techniques. Officers counted identifiable remains from at least 7 different individuals, with evidence suggesting many more had been processed previously. Murphy also discovered a private ledger hidden in a locked drawer in the basement. Unlike the public business ledgers upstairs, this document contained Schmidt's actual records of his operation. The ledger listed dates, brief descriptions of victims, and notes about the meat yield from each body. The entries went back to April of 1883 and documented 63 separate killings over the 9 years Schmidt had operated his shop. As the full scope of what they had discovered became clear, officers upstairs arrested Schmidt. The butcher's calm demeanor finally cracked when he was confronted with the evidence from the basement. He initially attempted to deny any knowledge of the human remains, claiming that someone else must have been using his basement without his knowledge. But when Murphy showed him the private ledger with detailed records in what appeared to be Schmidt's own handwriting, the butcher fell silent. Schmidt was transported to police headquarters and placed in a holding cell while investigators continued to process the evidence from his shop. The basement was examined in minute detail, with every surface tested for blood evidence, and every package of meat inventoried and documented. The remains found in the cold storage were carefully catalogued and turned over to the city coroner for examination. Meanwhile, word of the raid and the discovery spread rapidly through the Lower East Side. Within hours, crowds gathered outside Schmidt's shop, with many demanding to be told whether they might have unknowingly purchased human meat. The police were forced to post guards at the location to prevent the building from being vandalized or burned by outraged citizens. The two young men who had worked as Schmidt's assistants were brought in for questioning. Both were horrified when they learned what had been happening in the basement beneath the shop where they had worked. They insisted that they had never been allowed in the basement, that Schmidt had always claimed it was his private workspace and cold storage that he preferred to handle himself. Their testimony and their obvious shock suggested they had been genuinely unaware of Schmidt's crimes, and they were eventually cleared of any criminal involvement. The interrogation of Heinrich Schmidt began on July 13, 1892, with Detective Murphy leading the questioning. Schmidt's initial strategy was to deny everything despite the overwhelming evidence. He claimed the remains in his basement had been planted by someone trying to frame him. He insisted that all the meat he had sold was legitimate pork purchased from rural suppliers. He suggested that the private ledger was a forgery, but Murphy systematically destroyed each of these claims. He presented testimony from rural suppliers who had never heard of Schmidt. He brought in the handwriting experts who confirmed that the private ledger was written in Schmidt's hand. He walked Schmidt through the evidence found in the basement, forcing him to explain the specialized equipment and the systematic organization of the processing areas. After 2 days of interrogation, Schmidt's defenses finally collapsed. He admitted to killing and processing the 63 people documented in his ledger, but his confession revealed something perhaps even more disturbing than the murders themselves. Schmidt showed no remorse and seemed genuinely confused about why his actions were considered criminal. To him, he had simply identified an efficient solution to the business challenge of obtaining meat supplies. The immigrants he had killed were people no one cared about, people who would have died eventually anyway from disease or poverty. He had given their deaths purpose by using their bodies to feed others and to build a successful business. When Murphy asked Schmidt if he had ever considered that his victims were human beings who deserved to live, Schmidt responded that sentimentality was a luxury that businessmen could not afford. He had identified a resource that others were too squeamish to exploit, and he had built a profitable enterprise through courage and efficiency. The complete absence of moral recognition in Schmidt's responses suggested a form of psychopathy that the investigators found more chilling than the physical evidence of his crimes. As news of Schmidt's arrest and confession spread throughout New York, the city erupted in horror and outrage. Newspapers published extensive coverage, with reporters competing to provide the most detailed and shocking descriptions of what had been discovered in the basement. The New York Times ran the story on its front page for 5 consecutive days. Public anger focused not just on Schmidt himself, but on the authorities who had failed to detect his operation for 9 years, and on the social conditions that had made his victims invisible and disposable. Most horrifying to the public was the realization that thousands of New York families had unknowingly consumed human flesh purchased from Schmidt's shop. Many of Schmidt's former customers reported becoming physically ill upon learning what they had eaten. Some required medical treatment for psychological trauma. Several families who had been regular customers at Schmidt's shop reported that they could no longer eat any meat without becoming nauseated, having lost all trust in the food supply. The revelation also triggered a broader panic about food safety and the possibility that other butchers or food vendors might be engaged in similar practices. City health inspectors began conducting surprise inspections of butcher shops throughout Manhattan, looking for any irregularities in supply chains or business practices. The scandal prompted calls for stricter regulation of food vendors and for better systems to track and investigate missing persons, especially among immigrant populations. As authorities continued their investigation and prepared for trial, the question facing New York was not whether Schmidt was guilty, but rather what punishment could possibly be adequate for crimes of such magnitude and horror. The legal system would need to confront a case unlike any in the city's history. The trial of Heinrich Schmidt began on October 3, 1892, in New York County Criminal Court. The proceedings immediately became one of the most sensational trials in American legal history, with newspapers from across the nation and even from Europe sending reporters to cover what was being called the cannibal butcher case. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity every day of the trial, with hundreds of spectators crowding into every available space and thousands more gathering outside. The question facing the court was not whether Schmidt had committed the crimes, the evidence was overwhelming, but rather how to comprehend and punish evil that had operated for 9 years behind a facade of respectable commerce. The prosecution was led by District Attorney William Travers, a skilled lawyer with experience handling violent crime cases. Travers understood that while the physical evidence against Schmidt was damning, the psychological dimensions of the case required careful presentation. His strategy was to prove not just that Schmidt had killed 63 people, but that he had created a systematic operation that had turned murder into a profitable business and had made thousands of New Yorkers unwitting participants in cannibalism. Schmidt was represented by Charles Morrison, an experienced criminal defense attorney who faced a nearly impossible task. His client had confessed to the crimes and showed no remorse. Morrison's only viable strategy was to argue for some form of insanity defense, claiming that Schmidt suffered from mental illness that prevented him from understanding the moral implications of his actions. The trial opened with testimony from Detective Thomas Murphy, who described his investigation and the discoveries made during the raid on Schmidt's shop. Murphy's detailed account of the basement facility and the remains found there created a catalogue of horror that left many spectators and even some jurors visibly shaken. He presented the private ledger that documented all 63 victims, reading aloud the clinical entries that reduced human lives to calculations of meat yield and profit margin. The prosecution presented testimony from coroner's office staff who had examined the remains found in Schmidt's basement. Medical experts confirmed that the partial bodies and the packaged meat were indeed human flesh, and that the processing had been done with considerable professional skill. One physician testified that based on the sophistication of the butchering equipment and techniques, Schmidt had clearly been operating his human processing facility from the beginning of his business, rather than gradually descending into such practices. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from Anna Weber, whose brother Karl had been one of Schmidt's victims. Weber described receiving her brother's letters about his new life in America and his optimism about finding work, and then the sudden silence that had followed his mention of meeting with Heinrich Schmidt. When prosecutors showed her one of the packages of meat found in Schmidt's basement that was dated around the time of her brother's disappearance, Weber collapsed in the witness stand, overcome by the realization that her brother's remains might be contained in that package. The prosecution also called several of Schmidt's former customers to testify about their purchases and their horror upon learning what they had actually consumed. These witnesses provided emotional testimony about the psychological trauma of discovering they had unknowingly eaten human flesh. One woman testified that she had fed Schmidt's sausages to her children for years, praising how much they enjoyed them, and that she now could not look at her children without feeling contaminated by what she had unknowingly made them consume. The defense's strategy centered on arguing that Schmidt suffered from a form of moral insanity that prevented him from recognizing his actions as evil. Morrison called expert witnesses who testified about various forms of mental illness and suggested that Schmidt's complete lack of empathy and remorse indicated some fundamental defect in his moral reasoning capacity. The defense argued that someone with normal mental faculties would not be capable of systematically murdering and processing human beings while maintaining a facade of respectable business operations. However, the prosecution successfully countered this argument by demonstrating that Schmidt's actions showed sophisticated planning, careful risk management, and rational business thinking. Travers argued that someone suffering from genuine insanity would not be capable of operating such an elaborate deception for 9 years, maintaining detailed records, adapting his operation based on experience, and successfully managing both his criminal enterprise and his public reputation. Schmidt's ability to select victims who would not be missed, to process their bodies efficiently, and to sell the resulting products without detection all demonstrated rational thinking inconsistent with legal insanity. Schmidt himself testified in his own defense, and his testimony proved devastating to Morrison's insanity argument. On the witness stand, Schmidt spoke calmly and rationally about his operation, describing it in the same businesslike terms he had used during his interrogation. He explained his victim selection criteria, his processing methods, and his distribution strategies with the dispassionate efficiency of someone describing any commercial enterprise. When prosecutors asked if he understood that his victims were human beings who had wanted to live, Schmidt responded that sentimentality had no place in business decisions, and that he had simply identified an underutilized resource and exploited it effectively. The trial lasted 4 weeks, with the jury hearing testimony from over 50 witnesses and examining hundreds of pages of documentary evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning their verdict on October 31, 1892. Heinrich Schmidt was found guilty of first-degree murder on all 63 counts. The jury's recommendation was unanimous: death by hanging. The judge, in pronouncing sentence on November 2, 1892, delivered a statement that addressed both the specific crimes and their broader implications. He noted that Schmidt had exploited society's indifference to immigrant populations, targeting people whose lives were deemed valueless by the very community that should have protected them. The judge stated that Schmidt's victims had been murdered not just by the butcher's hand, but also by a social system that treated certain people as invisible and unworthy of concern or protection. The execution of Heinrich Schmidt took place on January 15, 1893, at the Tombs prison in Manhattan. Over 5,000 spectators gathered outside the prison, making it one of the largest crowds ever assembled for an execution in New York history. According to witnesses, Schmidt maintained his composure and his apparent inability to understand why he was being punished as he was led to the gallows. His final words were a statement that he had operated an efficient business, and that someday society would recognize the practicality of his methods. Schmidt was pronounced dead 18 minutes after the trapdoor opened. His body was buried in an unmarked grave in the prison cemetery, with officials fearing that a marked grave might become a site of morbid curiosity or even some form of perverse memorial. The Schmidt case had immediate and lasting impacts on New York City and beyond. Within weeks of the trial's conclusion, the city government enacted new regulations requiring all butcher shops and food vendors to maintain detailed records of their suppliers and to submit to regular inspections. Similar regulations were adopted in cities throughout the United States as the Schmidt case became a cautionary example of what could happen when food supply chains operated without oversight. The case also contributed to significant changes in how authorities tracked and investigated missing persons. The recognition that Schmidt had been able to kill 63 people over 9 years because their disappearances were never systematically investigated led to reforms in police procedures. New protocols were established requiring police departments to maintain centralized missing persons databases and to look for patterns in disappearances rather than treating each case as an isolated incident. More broadly, the Schmidt case forced American society to confront uncomfortable questions about how it treated immigrant populations. The fact that Schmidt's victims had been people whose lives were considered so valueless that their disappearances went unnoticed sparked debates about immigrant rights, social services, and the moral obligations of communities toward their most vulnerable members. Reform movements used the Schmidt case as evidence of the need for better support systems for immigrants and for recognition that all human lives had inherent worth, regardless of social status or origin. The building that had housed Schmidt's meat market became the focus of intense public debate. Initial proposals to preserve it as a memorial to the victims were rejected in favor of complete demolition. In December of 1892, the building was torn down, with the basement being filled with concrete to permanently seal the spaces where so many people had died. The site was eventually redeveloped, though businesses located there struggled for years to attract customers who were aware of the location's history. The psychological impact on Schmidt's former customers was profound and long-lasting. Many reported being unable to eat meat of any kind for years after learning what they had consumed. Some families relocated to other cities, unable to continue living in a neighborhood where they had unknowingly participated in cannibalism. Support groups were formed for victims' families and for customers struggling with the psychological trauma of the revelations. The case also had lasting impacts on criminal psychology and the study of serial killers. Heinrich Schmidt represented one of the earliest well-documented cases of a serial killer who operated through an established business and who showed complete absence of empathy or moral reasoning. His ability to maintain a facade of respectability while committing atrocities, his systematic approach to selecting and killing victims, and his apparent inability to recognize his actions as evil became subjects of study for psychologists and criminologists. The families of the 63 confirmed victims faced unique challenges. Many had been searching for missing relatives for years. The discovery that their loved ones had been murdered and their remains consumed brought terrible closure, but denied them the comfort of proper burial and memorialization. Several families filed civil suits against Schmidt's estate, though the estate had limited assets after legal fees and victim compensation claims. Officer Thomas Murphy, whose investigation had exposed Schmidt's operation, received commendations from the police department and the city. However, he reportedly struggled with knowing that 63 people had died. While he slowly gathered evidence, he remained with the police department until his retirement in 1910, during which time he became an advocate for missing persons investigations and immigrant rights. Today, more than 130 years after Heinrich Schmidt's execution, his case remains one of the most disturbing episodes in American criminal history. The site where his shop once stood is now occupied by modern development, with no marker indicating what occurred there. The victims remain largely forgotten, except by their descendants and by historians who study the darker aspects of urban history. But the case serves as a permanent reminder of several troubling truths. It demonstrates how evil can hide behind facades of respectability and commerce. It shows how society's most vulnerable members can be exploited and destroyed when communities fail to value all human lives equally. And it reveals how the failure to protect and account for marginalized populations creates opportunities for predators to operate with impunity. Heinrich Schmidt succeeded for 9 years not because he was particularly clever, but because he understood that society did not care about poor immigrants and would not notice or investigate their disappearances. 63 people died in that basement, murdered by a man who viewed them as nothing more than raw materials for his business. Their deaths serve as testimony to what happens when humans view some lives as having no value and their story remains a warning about the price of society's indifference to its most vulnerable members. The legacy of Schmidt's meat market is one of horror, but also of the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations, and of the recognition that business without ethical constraints can become a vehicle for evil. The thousands of New Yorkers who unknowingly consumed human flesh, purchased from Schmidt's shop, were victims almost as much as those who died, forced to live with the knowledge of what they had done without consent or awareness. Their collective trauma serves as a reminder that evil's impact extends far beyond its immediate victims, creating ripples of horror that can affect entire communities for generations.